The moment Molly Crawford saw the dust trail disappearing down the road, she knew her husband was never coming back, and the weight of that truth settled into her bones as she stood at the entrance of the small chapel in Concord, New Hampshire, clutching her 6-month-old daughter against her chest. It was May 1876, and the spring morning had started with such promise. Thomas had told her to wait at the chapel while he went to speak with the minister about christening their daughter. That had been 3 hours ago. The sun now hung high in the cloudless sky, beating down on the dusty road that cut through the center of town. Molly had watched wagon after wagon pass by, each one carrying farmers and their families into town for market day. Not one of them had been Thomas. She shifted little Emma in her arms, feeling the baby's soft breath against her neck. Emma had finally fallen asleep after crying for nearly an hour, sensing perhaps what her mother already knew. The small bundle of blankets Molly had packed that morning sat at her feet, everything she owned in the world reduced to a few dresses, some baby clothes, and the silver locket her mother had given her before she died. The chapel door creaked open behind her, and Reverend Matthews appeared, his weathered face creased with concern. He was an elderly man, nearly 70, with kind eyes that had seen too much suffering in this frontier town. "Mrs. Crawford," he said gently, "perhaps you should come inside and sit down. You have been standing out here for quite some time." Molly shook her head, unable to meet his eyes. "He will come back. He just needed to run an errand. He will come back." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were lies. Thomas had been growing more distant over the past months, ever since Emma was born. The baby had been sickly at first, and the medical bills had mounted. Thomas had started drinking more, spending their money at the saloon instead of bringing home wages from his job at the lumber mill. 2 weeks ago, he had lost that job entirely after showing up drunk 3 days in a row. "Mrs. Crawford," the Reverend said, his voice heavy with sympathy, "I saw Thomas yesterday evening. He was at the train station purchasing a ticket." The world seemed to tilt beneath Molly's feet. "A ticket? To Boston. He said he was going to find work, that he would send money back once he got settled." Molly's laugh came out bitter and broken. "He left us. He bought a ticket and he left us." She sank down onto the chapel steps, holding Emma close as tears finally began to fall. Everything she had built, every hope and dream she had nurtured since marrying Thomas 3 years ago, crumbled to dust. She was 22 years old, alone in a town where she knew almost no one, with a baby to feed and not a penny to her name. "What am I going to do?" she whispered, more to herself than to the Reverend. The old man sat down beside her with a soft grunt. "The Lord provides, child. We will figure something out. Perhaps you could stay at the boarding house until you find work. Mrs. Henderson is always looking for help with the laundry." But Molly knew the reality. She had no money for a room, and no one would hire a woman with an infant. Emma needed constant care, and any wages Molly could earn would barely cover food, let alone lodging. She was still sitting there, paralyzed by fear and despair, when she heard the sound of horse hooves approaching. Looking up, she saw a tall man riding a bay mare, leading a pack horse behind him. He rode with the easy confidence of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle, his broad shoulders outlined against the bright sky. The rider slowed as he passed the chapel, his eyes falling on Molly sitting on the steps with her baby and her small bundle of belongings. For a moment, their gazes met, and Molly saw something in his expression shift from casual curiosity to concern. He reined in his horse and dismounted in one fluid motion. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face was tanned from long days in the sun, and he had the lean, muscular build of a working cowboy. "Afternoon, Reverend," he said, tipping his hat. His voice was deep and warm, with a slight Western drawl that told Molly he had not grown up in New Hampshire. "Is everything all right here?" Reverend Matthews stood, brushing dust from his black coat. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hayes. I am afraid we have a rather difficult situation. This is Mrs. Crawford. Her husband he has left town rather suddenly." The cowboy, Mr. Hayes, turned his full attention to Molly. His eyes were sympathetic but not pitying, which she appreciated. She had already endured enough pitying looks from the townspeople who had watched Thomas stumble home drunk night after night. "Left town?" he asked quietly. "Yesterday," Molly said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. She refused to be ashamed, though her cheeks burned with humiliation. "I did not know until this morning. He told me to wait here at the chapel, and then he just disappeared." The cowboy was silent for a long moment, his jaw tightening. When he spoke, his voice was rough with barely contained anger. "What kind of man leaves his wife and child without so much as a word?" "A coward," Reverend Matthews said bluntly. "Forgive my language, but that is the truth of it." Emma stirred in Molly's arms, making soft, mewing sounds as she woke. Molly adjusted the blanket around her daughter's face, shielding her from the bright sunlight. The baby's eyes, as blue as her mother's, blinked open. The cowboy's expression softened as he looked at the infant. "How old?" "6 months," Molly answered. "Her name is Emma. Pretty name." He turned to the Reverend. "Is there family? Someone who can take them in?" "No one," the Reverend admitted. "Mrs. Crawford's parents have both passed, and her husband's family disowned him years ago. I was just suggesting that perhaps the boarding house might have a room." "I have no money," Molly said quietly. The words were like shards of glass in her throat. "I have nothing." The cowboy, Mr. Hayes, stood there for a long moment, his hand resting on his horse's neck as he appeared to be thinking. Finally, he turned back to Molly with a look of determination on his face. "You both have a home with me," he said simply. Molly stared at him, certain she had misheard. "What?" "I have a ranch about 10 miles outside of town. It is not much, just a small cabin and some grazing land, but it is solid and warm. I have been working it alone for the past 2 years, and I could use help with the cooking and the household chores." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I am offering you honest work, madam, with room and board included. You and your daughter would have a safe place to stay, and you would earn fair wages." Reverend Matthews looked surprised but pleased. "That is very generous of you, Mr. Hayes." Molly's mind was reeling. She did not know this man, had never seen him before today. Every instinct told her she should be suspicious, that no man would make such an offer without expecting something in return. But as she looked into his steady gray eyes, she saw only sincerity and a quiet strength that made her want to trust him. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you help us? You do not even know me." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "I know what it is like to be alone in the world with nowhere to turn," he finally said. "When I was 18, I lost my parents to cholera. My older brother and I tried to keep the family farm going in Missouri, but we lost it to the bank within a year. We headed west looking for work, but my brother got sick in Kansas. He died before we even made it to the territories." His voice remained steady, but Molly heard the old grief beneath the words. "A rancher outside of Dodge City took me in, gave me work and a place to sleep. He did not have to do that. I could have died on that trail, but he saw someone in need and he helped. I have been trying to pay that kindness forward ever since." Molly felt tears prick her eyes again. "I do not know what to say." "Say yes," he said with a small smile. "I promise you, madam, you and your daughter will be safe. I am offering work, nothing more. You will have your own room in the cabin, and I will treat you with the respect you deserve." She looked down at Emma, who was watching the stranger with wide, curious eyes. Molly knew she had no other options. The boarding house would not take her without payment, and even if she could find work, who would care for Emma during the day? This cowboy, this Mr. Hayes, was offering her a lifeline when she was drowning. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, we will come with you." Relief crossed his face. "Good. My name is Grant Hayes, and I give you my word that I will keep you both safe." Grant Hayes. Molly committed the name to memory as he turned to speak with the Reverend in low tones. She felt as though she were in a dream, everything moving too fast for her to fully comprehend. Just this morning, she had been a married woman waiting for her husband. Now she was abandoned, destitute, and about to leave town with a stranger. But as Grant returned to her side and held out his hand to help her to her feet, she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. Maybe it was foolish to trust him, but something in his manner told her he was a man of his word. "I have some supplies to pick up from the general store," Grant said. "Then we can head out to the ranch. It is about an hour's ride if we take it slow." "I can ride," Molly said, then hesitated, "but I have Emma." "You can ride with me. I will hold the reins and you can hold your daughter. My horse is gentle, she will not spook." Within the hour, they were ready to leave. Grant had purchased extra supplies from the general store, including several yards of soft cotton fabric and some canned milk, which he said was for the baby. He had also bought a new blanket, which he wrapped around Molly's shoulders despite her protests. "The evenings get cold out on the range," he said firmly. "You will need it." He helped her mount his horse, being careful not to jostle Emma. Then he swung up behind her, his arms coming around on either side to grip the reins. Molly stiffened at the closeness, but Grant maintained a respectful distance, his focus entirely on guiding the horse. As they rode out of Concord, Molly watched the town disappear behind them. It had never felt like home, not really. She and Thomas had only been living there for 8 months, having moved from Vermont when Thomas heard about work at the lumber mill. Now, she was leaving with nothing to show for that time except Emma and hard-learned lessons about misplaced trust. The landscape opened up before them, rolling hills covered in new grass and wildflowers. The sky stretched endlessly overhead, so blue it almost hurt to look at. Molly had grown up in cities and small towns, and the vast openness of the countryside both thrilled and frightened her. Grant rode in silence for most of the journey, occasionally pointing out landmarks. "That is Miller's Creek," he said at one point, gesturing to a ribbon of water cutting through a valley. "It runs through my property, keeps the grass green even in the dry months. Have you been ranching long?" Molly asked, trying to make conversation. "About 5 years, though I have only had my own place for 2. Before that, I worked for other ranchers, saved every penny I could. When old Mr. Patterson decided to sell this parcel and move back east to be with his daughter, I bought it from him." "Do you have cattle?" "A small herd, about 30 head. It is not enough to make a fortune, but it is enough to live on, especially with the vegetables I grow and the chickens. I have been thinking about expanding, maybe getting some horses to breed and sell." There was pride in his voice when he talked about his ranch, and Molly found herself curious to see this place that he had worked so hard to build. They rode through a stand of tall pines, and then the land opened up again into a wide meadow. In the distance, Molly could see a cabin nestled against a hillside, smoke rising from its chimney. As they drew closer, she could make out more details. A barn, a chicken coop, a well with a bucket, and a vegetable garden protected by a low fence. "This is it," Grant said, and she heard the satisfaction in his voice. "This is home." The cabin was larger than Molly had expected, built from solid logs with a stone chimney. The roof looked new and the windows had real glass, not just oiled paper. A covered porch ran along the front, with 2 rocking chairs sitting empty. Grant dismounted first, then carefully helped Molly down, taking care not to disturb Emma. The baby had fallen asleep again during the ride, lulled by the steady rhythm of the horse's gait. "Let me show you inside," Grant said, leading the way up the porch steps. The interior was simple but comfortable. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a cast-iron stove in one corner and a table with 4 chairs in the center. A braided rug covered the wooden floor and curtains hung at the windows. Everything was clean and well-maintained, though Molly could see the telltale signs of a man living alone. Dishes in the sink, dust on the mantel, and a general lack of homey touches. "There are 2 bedrooms," Grant said, pointing to 2 doors on the far wall. "You and Emma can have the larger one. It has a real bed frame and mattress. I have been sleeping there, but I will move my things into the smaller room." "I cannot take your room," Molly protested. "You can and you will," he said firmly. "You need more space for the baby, and the bigger room stays warmer at night because it is closer to the stove." He was already moving toward the bedroom, gathering up his few possessions. Molly stood in the middle of the main room, feeling overwhelmed. This morning she had been desperate and alone. Now she was standing in a stranger's home, about to start a new life she could never have imagined. The bedroom Grant gave her was indeed larger, with a proper bed, a dresser, and a trunk at the foot of the bed. There was even a cradle in the corner, which Grant said had been left behind by the previous owner. "Mr. Patterson's daughter had a baby," he explained. "She did not want to take it with her on the train trip, so she left it here. I was going to use it for kindling, but I suppose it is lucky I did not." Molly ran her hand over the smooth wood of the cradle. "It is perfect," Grant nodded, looking pleased. "I will let you get settled. There is water in the pitcher on the dresser if you want to wash up. I need to tend to the horses and check on the cattle, but I will be back in an hour or so to make supper." After he left, Molly sank down on the bed, still holding Emma. The mattress was comfortable, stuffed with what felt like fresh straw and covered with clean sheets. She looked around the room, taking in the simple furnishings and the way the afternoon light slanted through the window. She should be terrified. She should be questioning her sanity for leaving town with a strange man. But instead, she felt the first stirrings of something she had not experienced in a long time: hope. Emma woke and began to fuss, and Molly realized she was probably hungry. She settled into the rocking chair by the window and began to nurse the baby, watching through the glass as Grant moved around the property with easy efficiency. He led his horses into the barn, then emerged a few minutes later with a bucket, heading toward what she assumed was the chicken coop. As she sat there, feeding her daughter and watching this man who had shown them such unexpected kindness, Molly felt the tight knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. Maybe everything would be all right. Maybe, somehow, they had found their way to exactly where they needed to be. When Emma finished eating, Molly changed her diaper and laid her in the cradle. The baby gazed up at her with solemn blue eyes, and Molly felt a surge of fierce love and determination. She would work hard. She would prove to Grant that he had not made a mistake by taking them in. And somehow, she would build a good life for her daughter. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her dresses in the small wardrobe and placing her hairbrush and her mother's locket on the dresser. Then she ventured out into the main room, looking around to see what needed to be done. The dishes were the first priority. She heated water on the stove and scrubbed them clean, then wiped down the table and counters. She found a broom in the corner and swept the floor, then dusted the mantel and the windowsills. By the time Grant returned, the cabin looked considerably more tidy. He stopped in the doorway, surprise evident on his face. "You did not have to do all this. I told you to rest." "I wanted to," Molly said. "You have been very kind to us. The least I can do is help with the housework." He smiled, and it transformed his face, making him look younger and less serious. "Well, I appreciate it. The place has not looked this good since I moved in." He washed his hands at the basin, then began pulling food from the pantry. "I am not much of a cook," he admitted. "Mostly I just fry up some salt pork and beans. But I have some venison that I smoked last week, and there are potatoes in the root cellar." "Let me," Molly said, moving to the stove. "Please, I want to be useful." Grant hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but if you need anything, just ask." Working together in the small kitchen, they prepared a simple but hearty meal. Molly surprised herself by how comfortable she felt moving around the space, asking Grant where things were kept and listening as he told her about the ranch and his daily routine. "I usually wake at dawn to milk the cow and feed the chickens," he explained. "Then I check on the cattle, make sure they have not gotten through the fence during the night. Most days, I am working on something around the property, fixing fence posts, clearing brush, that sort of thing. In the summer, I put up hay for the winter." "It sounds like hard work," Molly said, stirring the pot of beans. "It is, but it is honest work, and it is mine." He paused, his expression growing serious. "I know this is not what you expected when you woke up this morning. I know you must be scared and uncertain, but I want you to know that you and Emma are welcome here for as long as you need. There is no pressure, no expectations beyond helping with the household chores. If you ever want to leave, I will take you back to town, no questions asked." Molly turned to look at him, her throat tight with emotion. "Why are you being so kind to us?" He met her gaze steadily. "Because it is the right thing to do. Because everyone deserves a second chance. And because I know what it is like to feel alone in the world." They ate dinner at the small table, and Molly was pleased to see Grant's appreciation for the meal. It was nothing fancy, just fried venison, beans, and boiled potatoes, but it was hot and filling. "This is the best meal I have had in months," he said. "You are a fine cook." "My mother taught me," Molly said softly. "She always said that a good meal could make the worst day better. Your mother was a wise woman." After dinner, Grant insisted on doing the dishes while Molly tended to Emma. He moved around the kitchen with surprising competence, and Molly found herself watching him as she rocked her daughter in front of the fire. He was different from Thomas in every way. Where Thomas had been quick to anger and slow to help, Grant was patient and generous. Where Thomas had spent his evenings drinking and complaining, Grant seemed content with quiet domesticity. She caught herself comparing them and forced herself to stop. It was not fair to either man, and besides, she had no business thinking about Grant in any way other than as her employer. As darkness fell, Grant lit the oil lamps and settled into one of the chairs with a book. Molly was surprised to see that he could read and read well, his eyes moving quickly across the page. Most cowboys she had encountered were barely literate. "What are you reading?" she asked. He held up the book so she could see the cover. "It is about animal husbandry. I am trying to learn more about breeding cattle so I can improve my herd. You like to read?" "When I have time. My mother was a school teacher before she married my father. She made sure my brother and I could read and write and do our numbers. She said education was the one thing no one could ever take away from you." Molly felt a pang of kinship. "My mother said the same thing. She taught me to read before I even started school." They talked for a while longer, sharing stories about their childhoods and their families. Molly learned that Grant had grown up in Missouri, that his father had been a farmer, and his mother had come from a well-to-do family back east. She told him about her own upbringing in Boston, how her father had been a clerk and her mother had taken in sewing to make ends meet. "How did you end up in New Hampshire?" Grant asked. Molly's expression grew guarded. "I met Thomas when I was 19. He was charming and handsome, and he promised me a good life. We married quickly, maybe too quickly. At first, everything was wonderful, but then his true nature started to show. He could not keep a job. He drank too much. And when Emma was born, instead of stepping up and being a father, he just pulled away." Her voice broke slightly on the last words, and she looked down at her sleeping daughter. "I kept telling myself things would get better. I kept making excuses for him. But now I see that I was just fooling myself." "You were not fooling yourself," Grant said gently. "You were hoping. There is a difference." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her, and she had to blink back tears. "I should put Emma to bed," she said, standing quickly. "Thank you for dinner. And for everything." "Good night, Molly," he said softly. "Sleep well." In the privacy of her room, Molly laid Emma in the cradle and then sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of the day. So much had changed in just a few hours. This morning she had been a married woman, however unhappily. Now she was alone, abandoned, living in a stranger's home. But as she looked around the simple room, at the solid walls and the comfortable bed, she felt safer than she had in months. Grant Hayes might be a stranger, but he was an honorable one. She could sense it in the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, the way he had looked at Emma with such gentleness. She changed into her nightgown and climbed into bed, exhaustion finally catching up with her. The mattress was comfortable, and the blankets smelled of fresh air and pine. Through the wall, she could hear the soft sounds of Grant moving around the main room, banking the fire and preparing for bed. As she drifted off to sleep, her last thought was that maybe, just maybe, her worst day had led her to something better. The next few weeks fell into a comfortable rhythm. Molly woke each morning to find Grant already up and working, and she would prepare breakfast while Emma played on a blanket in the corner of the kitchen. Grant would come in from his morning chores, and they would eat together, talking about the day ahead. After breakfast, Grant would head out to work on the ranch while Molly tackled the household chores. She cleaned and cooked and did the laundry, hanging it on the line to dry in the warm spring sun. In the afternoons, when Emma napped, she would work in the vegetable garden, weeding and watering and learning which plants were which. It was hard work, but it was satisfying in a way that her life with Thomas had never been. Here, she could see the results of her labor. The cabin stayed clean, the meals were hot and nutritious, and the garden flourished under her care. Grant proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to collect eggs from the chicken coop and how to milk the cow. He taught her to recognize the different calls of the birds that lived around the property and pointed out the tracks of deer and rabbits in the soft earth by the creek. Emma thrived in the country air. Her cheeks grew rosy, and she began to smile and babble more each day. Grant was surprisingly good with the baby, often holding her in the evenings after dinner while Molly cleaned up. He would talk to her in a low, soothing voice, telling her stories about the ranch and the animals. One evening, about 3 weeks after they arrived, Molly came out of Emma's room to find Grant standing at the window, looking out at the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the light cast golden shadows across his face. "It is beautiful," she said softly. He turned, a slight smile on his lips. "Best part of the day. No matter how hard the work has been, watching the sun go down always makes it feel worthwhile." She moved to stand beside him at the window. "I want to thank you again for everything you have done for us. I do not think you realize what a difference you have made in our lives." "You have made a difference in mine too," he said quietly. "This place feels like a home now, not just a house. I did not realize how lonely I was until you and Emma arrived." Their eyes met, and Molly felt something shift between them. It was not attraction exactly, or at least not only that. It was recognition, a sense of two people who understood each other's loneliness and pain. Grant seemed to realize they were standing too close, and he stepped back, clearing his throat. "I should check on the horses one more time before bed." After he left, Molly stood at the window for a long time, her mind churning. She was developing feelings for Grant. She could no longer deny it. But it was too soon, far too soon. She was still legally married to Thomas, even if he had abandoned her. And even if she were free, what made her think Grant would be interested in a woman with a baby and a failed marriage behind her? She forced herself to focus on the practical. She had a safe place to live and meaningful work to do. That was enough. It had to be enough. But over the following days, Molly found it increasingly difficult to ignore the way her heart lifted when Grant came in from the fields, or the way her pulse quickened when their hands accidentally touched while washing dishes. She noticed small things about him: the way he hummed while he worked, the gentleness in his strong hands, the laugh lines around his eyes. One afternoon in early June, a neighbor rode up to the ranch. He was an older man with a weathered face and a friendly smile, and he introduced himself as Jack Miller, owner of the property to the south. "Heard you had some help around the place now," he said to Grant. "Thought I would ride over and say hello." Grant introduced Molly as his housekeeper, and if Jack noticed anything unusual about the arrangement, he was polite enough not to mention it. He accepted Molly's offer of coffee and sat on the porch chatting with Grant about cattle prices and weather patterns. Before he left, Jack turned to Grant with a speculative look. "There is a dance in town next Saturday for the Founding Day celebration. You should come. Might be nice for Mrs. Crawford to meet some of the other ladies in the area." Grant glanced at Molly. "Would you like to go?" Part of her wanted to refuse. She was not ready to face the townspeople, to see their curious looks and hear their whispered questions about what had happened with Thomas. But another part of her longed for company, for music and laughter and a chance to feel normal again. "I would like that," she said. The week leading up to the dance was busy. Molly took apart one of her better dresses and remade it, updating the style and adding some lace trim she found in Grant's sewing basket. She baked bread and pies for the supper that would precede the dance, wanting to contribute something to the community. Grant seemed more nervous than usual as the day approached. He rode into town midweek and came back with a new shirt and a haircut. Molly tried not to think about why he was making such an effort. Saturday arrived bright and clear. They loaded the wagon with Molly's pies and made the journey into Concord, with Emma secure in a basket at Molly's feet. The town square had been decorated with bunting and banners, and long tables were set up for the meal. Music drifted from the direction of the church hall where the dance would be held. As they climbed down from the wagon, Molly felt suddenly nervous. What would people think when they saw her with Grant? Would they assume the worst? But Grant seemed oblivious to her concerns. He offered her his arm with natural courtesy, and together they walked toward the gathering crowd. Reverend Matthews spotted them immediately and hurried over, his face wreathed in smiles. "Mrs. Crawford, Mr. Hayes, how wonderful to see you. And little Emma, my goodness, how she has grown." Other people began to approach, curious about the newcomers. Grant introduced Molly to his neighbors, and she found most of them to be warm and welcoming. The women cooed over Emma, and the men clapped Grant on the shoulder and told him he was lucky to have found such good help. A few of the matrons looked at her with suspicion, and Molly overheard one whispered comment about propriety. But Grant stayed close to her side, his presence a silent message of protection and support. The meal was a festive affair, with everyone contributing dishes and the long tables groaning under the weight of so much food. Molly's pies were well received, and several women complimented her baking. She found herself relaxing, enjoying the company and the laughter. After the meal, the musicians began to play in the church hall and couples started to drift toward the dance floor. Grant turned to Molly with a slightly shy expression. "Would you like to dance?" Her heart jumped. "What about Emma? I will watch her," said Mrs. Miller, Jack's wife, a plump, grandmotherly woman with kind eyes. "You young people go and enjoy yourselves." Before Molly could protest, Emma was whisked away to sit with a group of older women who were clearly delighted to have a baby to fuss over. Grant took her hand and led her into the hall. The first dance was a lively reel, and Molly was grateful for the quick pace that made conversation impossible. But the second dance was a waltz, and suddenly she found herself in Grant's arms, his hand at her waist, moving in slow circles around the floor. "You are a good dancer," she said, surprised. "My mother insisted on teaching us," he said with a slight smile. "She said that even farmers needed to know how to conduct themselves in polite society." They moved together easily, and Molly was acutely aware of how close they were, how his hand felt warm through the fabric of her dress, how his gray eyes watched her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Molly," he said quietly, and something in his tone made her look up at him. "I need to tell you something." Her heart was pounding now. "What is it?" He seemed to struggle for words, his jaw tightening. "These past weeks, having you at the ranch, it has made me realize how empty my life was before. You and Emma, you have brought light and warmth to that place. You have made it a home." "Grant," she whispered, but he continued. "I know it is too soon. I know you are still dealing with what Thomas did to you, but I need you to know that my feelings for you have grown beyond just respect and friendship." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "I care for you, Molly, deeply." She felt tears prick her eyes. "I care for you too, more than I should, more than is wise. But Grant, I am still married. Even though Thomas left, even though he abandoned us in the eyes of the law and the church, I am still his wife." "Then we will get you a divorce," Grant said firmly. "It is possible, especially given that he deserted you." "Divorce?" The word felt scandalous on her tongue. "Grant, the social stigma, the cost, the time it would take. I do not care about any of that. I only care about you and Emma and building a future together." His hand tightened on hers. "I love you, Molly. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you sitting on those chapel steps, refusing to give up despite everything that had happened. You are strong and brave and good, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that not all men are like Thomas." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I love you too. I did not want to, did not think I could after everything, but I do. You have shown me what it means to be truly cared for, to be valued and respected." The music swirled around them as they stood still in the middle of the dance floor, looking into each other's eyes. Then Grant smiled, that rare, beautiful smile that transformed his whole face. "Then we will figure it out together," he said. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes, we will make this work." For the rest of the evening, Molly felt as though she were floating. She danced with Grant and talked with the other women and held Emma, and through it all, she felt a joy she had not experienced in years. Grant loved her. She loved him. It might be complicated and difficult, but they would face it together. On the ride home, with Emma asleep between them, Grant reached over and took Molly's hand. They did not speak, but the silence was comfortable, filled with promise and hope. The next morning, Grant rode into town and met with a lawyer about filing for divorce on Molly's behalf. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Mr. Peterson, listened to the story and nodded thoughtfully. "You have grounds," he said. Desertion is a valid reason for divorce in this state, especially when there is a dependent child involved. However, I must warn you that the process can take several months, possibly as long as a year. We will need to prove that Mr. Crawford has indeed abandoned his family, and we will need to make an effort to locate him to serve him with papers. Do whatever you need to do, Grant said. Money is not an issue. Mr. Peterson raised an eyebrow. That is generous of you, Mr. Hayes, considering that you are not the husband in question. I am going to be her husband, Grant said firmly, as soon as the law allows it. The lawyer's expression softened. I see. Well then, let us get started. I will need Mrs. Crawford to come in and sign some papers, and I will begin the process of tracking down Mr. Crawford. Over the summer months, the legal proceedings moved forward slowly. Mr. Peterson hired an investigator who eventually traced Thomas to Boston, where he was living under an assumed name and working in a shipyard. When served with the divorce papers, Thomas did not contest them, which Mr. Peterson said would speed things along considerably. Meanwhile, life at the ranch continued. The days grew hot, and Grant worked long hours putting up hay and tending to his growing herd. Molly kept the house and the garden, and in her spare time, she began making plans for how she might improve the cabin once she and Grant were married. Because she no longer doubted that they would marry. Grant's love for her was evident in every gesture, every word, every look. He was patient with her fears and insecurities, never pushing her for more than she was ready to give. He was wonderful with Emma, playing with her in the evenings and even walking the floor with her when she was teething and fussy. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch watching the stars come out, Grant said, "I have been thinking about expanding the cabin." "Oh." Molly looked at him with interest. "I thought we could add on 2 more rooms, one for Emma and one for other children, if we have them." He looked at her shyly. "I would like a family if you would too." Molly felt warmth spread through her chest. "I would like that very much." Emma should have brothers and sisters. "I was thinking we could also add a proper parlor, a place for you to entertain guests and maybe do some sewing, and a bigger kitchen with more counter space and a pantry." "That sounds wonderful," she said softly. "But Grant, that will cost a lot of money." "I have been saving for years," he said. "And cattle prices are good right now. I sold 10 head last week for more than I expected. We can afford it." She reached over and took his hand. "You are already giving us so much. I do not want you to spend all your savings on us." "You are not just anyone," he said, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing her knuckles. "You are going to be my wife. This ranch will belong to both of us, and I want it to be a place where you are comfortable and happy." In August, Reverend Matthews sent word that the divorce had been finalized. Thomas had signed all the necessary papers, and the judge had granted the decree. Molly was legally free. She stood in the kitchen, holding the letter from Mr. Peterson, and felt a complex tangle of emotions. Relief, certainly. Sadness for the dreams that had died, and underneath it all, excitement for the future that was now possible. Grant came in from the barn and saw her holding the letter. "Is that what I think it is?" she nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms. "Marry me, Molly. Marry me as soon as we can arrange it." "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married 3 weeks later in the same chapel where Molly had been abandoned just 4 months earlier. But this time, as she walked down the aisle in a new dress that the women of the town had helped her sew, she felt only joy. Grant stood at the front of the church, looking handsome in a new suit, his eyes shining as he watched her approach. Emma was in Mrs. Miller's arms, wearing a little white dress and waving her chubby hands at her mother. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony with obvious pleasure, his voice ringing out as he pronounced them husband and wife. When Grant kissed her, Molly felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. The whole community turned out for the celebration that followed. There was music and dancing and so much food that the tables nearly collapsed. Jack Miller gave a toast that made everyone laugh and cry, and Mrs. Miller presented them with a beautiful quilt she had made for their wedding present. As the sun began to set, Grant and Molly slipped away from the party and headed home to their ranch. Emma had fallen asleep in Molly's arms, exhausted from all the excitement. "Mrs. Hayes," Grant said as they drove through the gathering dusk, "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Molly said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "So do I." That night, after they had put Emma to bed, they finally came together as husband and wife. Grant was tender and patient, and Molly marveled at how different it was to be with a man who truly loved her. Where Thomas had been selfish and rough, Grant was generous and gentle. He made her feel cherished and desired, and when she fell asleep in his arms, she felt safe in a way she had never experienced before. The following months were the happiest of Molly's life. She and Grant worked side by side, building their ranch and their future. The addition to the cabin was completed in October, giving them a proper parlor and 2 more bedrooms. Molly decorated with care, making curtains and braiding rugs and arranging the furniture until everything felt just right. Emma took her first steps in November, wobbling across the parlor floor and into Grant's waiting arms. He caught her and lifted her high, his face alight with joy and pride. Watching them together, Molly felt tears of gratitude well up in her eyes. Grant had given her daughter something precious, a father who loved her and would never leave her. Winter came, bringing snow and cold winds, but the cabin was warm and snug. They spent the long evenings by the fire, with Grant reading aloud while Molly sewed and Emma played with the wooden toys Grant had carved for her. In January, Molly realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had not wanted to say anything until she was sure. When she told Grant, he picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing with delight. "When?" he asked, setting her down gently. "Late summer, I think. August or September." He placed his hand on her still flat belly, his expression full of wonder. "A baby, our baby. Are you happy?" "Happy does not even begin to cover it," he said, pulling her close. "You have given me everything I ever wanted, Molly. A home, a family, a purpose. I love you so much." "I love you too," she whispered against his chest. "More than I ever thought possible." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Molly felt well, just a bit of morning sickness in the first few months. Grant fussed over her constantly, insisting she rest more and not lift anything heavy. She found his concern endearing, even when it became a bit excessive. Emma was nearly 2 years old now, a bright, curious toddler who followed her parents everywhere and chattered constantly in her own language. She seemed to understand that something was changing, often patting Molly's growing belly and saying, "Baby." In late August, on a warm afternoon when the cicadas sang in the trees and the air smelled of ripening grain, Molly went into labor. Grant sent for Mrs. Miller, who arrived quickly and took charge with calm efficiency. She shooed Grant out of the bedroom, despite his protests, and helped Molly through the long hours of labor. As the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Molly gave birth to a son. He was perfect, with a head of dark hair and lungs that announced his arrival to the world with impressive volume. Mrs. Miller cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket, then placed him in Molly's arms. "He is beautiful," she said with a smile. "Strong and healthy." Grant was allowed back into the room, and the expression on his face when he saw his son made Molly's heart swell. He approached the bed almost reverently, his eyes wide with wonder. "Can I hold him?" he asked quietly. Molly passed the baby to him, watching as Grant cradled his son with infinite care. The baby quieted immediately, his dark blue eyes blinking up at his father. "Hello, little one," Grant said softly. "Welcome to the world. I am your papa, and I promise I will always take care of you." Molly felt tears slip down her cheeks. What should we name him? They had discussed names but had not settled on one. Grant looked at the baby for a long moment. "What about Samuel, after my father?" "Samuel Hayes," Molly said, testing the name. "I love it." Emma was brought in to meet her baby brother, and she stared at him with solemn fascination before declaring him tiny and requesting to go back outside to play. Over the next weeks, they settled into the rhythms of life with a newborn. Samuel was an easier baby than Emma had been, sleeping for longer stretches and nursing well. Grant was a devoted father, often taking the baby from Molly so she could rest, walking the floor with him at night and talking to him in a low, soothing voice. Molly watched her husband with their children and marveled at how much her life had changed. 2 years ago, she had been abandoned and alone, with no idea how she would survive. Now she had a husband who adored her, 2 beautiful children, and a home filled with love and laughter. One evening in October, as they sat together on the porch after the children were in bed, Grant turned to her with a contented smile. "Do you remember the day we met?" he asked. "How could I forget? It was the worst and best day of my life. I remember thinking you were the bravest person I had ever seen. You were sitting there on those chapel steps, your whole world falling apart, but you were not giving up. You were holding Emma and planning your next move, determined to survive. I did not feel brave. I felt terrified." "Brave people are always terrified," Grant said. "That is what makes them brave. They do what they have to do despite the fear." He took her hand. "I am so grateful that I was riding through town that day. I cannot imagine my life without you and Emma and Samuel now." "I think it was meant to be," Molly said softly. "All the pain and heartbreak that came before, it led me to you, and I would go through it all again if I knew this was where I would end up." Grant leaned over and kissed her gently. "You will never have to go through anything like that again. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you and our children are safe and happy and loved." "You already do," she said. "Every single day, you show us what love really means." They sat together in companionable silence, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. The ranch was quiet except for the distant lowing of cattle and the chirp of crickets in the grass. Inside the cabin, their children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were cherished and protected. The years that followed were good ones. The ranch prospered as Grant's hard work and careful management paid off. He expanded his herd and began breeding horses, which proved to be lucrative. Molly continued to manage the household and care for their growing family, but she also began taking in sewing from the women in town, earning her own money and enjoying the creative outlet. Emma grew into a lively, intelligent girl who loved helping her father with the animals. Samuel was a quieter child, more studious, who would sit for hours looking at the pictures in Grant's books. 2 years after Samuel was born, Molly gave birth to twin girls whom they named Grace and Hope. The twins were identical, with Molly's blue eyes and Grant's dark hair, and they were utterly fearless, climbing everything and getting into constant mischief. The cabin was expanded again to accommodate the growing family, with a second story added that held 3 more bedrooms. Molly planted flower gardens around the house, and Grant built a proper barn with a loft for storing hay. They bought more land from a neighboring rancher who was retiring, doubling the size of their property. But the best part was not the material success or the growing prosperity. The best part was the love that filled their home. Grant and Molly grew closer with each passing year, their bond deepening as they faced life's challenges together. They laughed together and prayed together and raised their children with patience and wisdom. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Grant surprised Molly with a trip to Boston. They left the children with Mrs. Miller, who had become like a grandmother to them, and took the train east. It was Molly's first time back to the city since she had left with Thomas all those years ago. Walking through the familiar streets, Molly felt like a different person from the naive young woman who had married Thomas so quickly. She was older now, wiser, shaped by hardship and love into someone stronger. Grant took her to the theater and to fine restaurants, treating her like a queen. On their last night in the city, as they stood on a bridge overlooking the harbor, he gave her a gift, a gold locket on a chain. "Open it," he said with a smile. Inside were 2 tiny photographs, one of Emma and Samuel and one of Grace and Hope. Molly's eyes filled with tears. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "You are beautiful," Grant said, pulling her close. "And I am the luckiest man alive to call you my wife." "I am the lucky one," Molly said. "You saved me, Grant. You and the children, you gave me a reason to live, a reason to hope." "We saved each other," he said simply. "And we built something good together." They returned home to a joyful reunion with their children, who had missed them terribly. Emma, now 12 years old, had taken charge of her younger siblings with admirable competence. Samuel, who was 10, had helped with the chores. Even the 7-year-old twins had tried to behave, though Mrs. Miller admitted with a laugh that they had given her quite a run for her money. Life continued its steady rhythm. Emma grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's compassion and her father's work ethic. She married at 19 to a neighboring rancher's son, a good man who loved her deeply. The wedding was held at the ranch, with half the county in attendance. Samuel showed an aptitude for learning that surprised everyone. Grant hired a tutor for him, and at 16, Samuel went east to attend college, planning to become a veterinarian so he could return and care for the animals on the ranch and the surrounding farms. The twins, Grace and Hope, remained inseparable through childhood and into young adulthood. They were different from their older siblings, more adventurous and independent. They both learned to ride and rope as well as any cowboy, and they worked the ranch alongside their father with skill and enthusiasm. As Molly and Grant grew older, they watched their children build their own lives with pride and satisfaction. They became grandparents multiple times over, and the ranch that had once been home to just one lonely cowboy now rang with the laughter of multiple generations. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Emma came with her husband and 4 children. Samuel had finished his studies and returned home with his new wife, a smart, funny woman he had met at school. The twins, now 23, were still living at home, though Grace had been courting a young man from town, and Hope had announced her intention to start her own horse breeding business. As Molly looked around at all the people crowded into her home, all the love and life that filled these rooms, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. She thought back to that terrible day in Concord, when she had been abandoned at the chapel with Emma in her arms and no hope for the future. Grant appeared at her side, his hair now streaked with silver but his eyes as warm and loving as ever. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I am thinking about how far we have come," she said, leaning into his embrace, "and how grateful I am for every step of the journey." He kissed the top of her head. "Even the hard parts, especially the hard parts," she said, "because they brought me to you." Later that night, after all the guests had gone home and the house was quiet, Molly and Grant sat together on the porch as they had done countless times over the years. The stars were brilliant overhead, and a warm breeze carried the scent of hay and flowers. "You ever wonder what your life would have been like if I had not ridden through Concord that day?" Grant asked. "Sometimes," Molly admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it. I believe things happen for a reason. Thomas leaving me was the worst thing that ever happened to me, but it opened the door for the best thing that ever happened to me. You." "I love you, Molly Hayes," Grant said. "I have loved you from the moment I saw you sitting on those chapel steps, and I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you," Molly said, "for seeing me when I was invisible, for offering me hope when I had none, for making me believe in love again." They sat together in the darkness, two people who had found each other when they both needed saving. They had built a life together, raised a family, created a legacy of love that would continue long after they were gone. The chapel where they had first met still stood in Concord, a quiet witness to new beginnings and second chances. Sometimes, when Molly and Grant drove into town, they would stop there for a moment, remembering. Molly would look at those steps where she had sat in despair, and then she would look at Grant, and she would thank God for the lonely cowboy who had said those words that changed her life forever. "You both have a home with me." Those words had been more than just an offer of shelter. They had been a promise of family, of belonging, of love. And Grant had kept that promise every single day since. As the years continued to pass, the ranch remained a place of warmth and welcome. Grandchildren grew up running through the same fields where their parents had played. The cabin that had once housed just Grant now held generations of memories and love. Molly and Grant grew old together, their love deepening with each passing season. They held hands during church services and took evening walks together even when their steps grew slower. They still sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset and talking about their day, their children, their dreams for the future. When Grant turned 60, the ranch was thriving under the combined management of Samuel and the twins. Emma's oldest son had also expressed interest in ranching, and he came to work alongside his uncle and aunts, learning the trade. Molly spent her days surrounded by her children and grandchildren, teaching the young girls to sew and bake, telling stories about the old days, and dispensing wisdom earned through years of living and loving. She had become the matriarch of a large, boisterous family, and she took great joy in watching them all flourish. One spring evening, as Molly and Grant sat on the porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard, Grant turned to her with a tender smile. "I have been thinking," he said, "about legacy and what we leave behind." "And what have you concluded?" Molly asked, taking his hand. "That we did good work," he said simply. "Look at all of this. These children, this family, this love. We built something that will last long after we are gone." Molly squeezed his hand. "You built it, Grant. You took in a desperate woman and her baby when you did not have to. You gave us a home and a future. Everything that came after started with your kindness." "No," Grant said firmly. "We built it together. Your strength, your love, your determination to make a good life for Emma, those things are what made this family strong. I just provided the starting point." They watched as their youngest grandson chased after one of the barn cats, his laughter ringing out in the warm evening air. Emma's daughter was helping her grandmother Hope with the horses, and Samuel's children were playing a game of tag near the creek. "Do you remember what you said to me on the day we met?" Molly asked suddenly. "I said a lot of things that day," Grant replied with a smile. "You said that I was not alone anymore," Molly said softly. "That was the moment I started to believe that maybe things would be all right, because you saw me, really saw me, and you offered me hope when I had none left." Grant lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "And you taught me that a house is not a home until it is filled with love. I had built a good ranch, but it was empty until you and Emma arrived. You gave me purpose and joy and a reason to work hard and dream big." As the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, painting the sky with color, Molly reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The pain of abandonment had faded over the years, replaced by the deep security of being truly loved. She rarely thought of Thomas anymore, and when she did, it was with a strange sort of gratitude. His betrayal had hurt terribly, but it had also freed her to find a man who truly deserved her love. The years continued to be kind to them. Grant remained healthy and active well into his 60s, still working the ranch alongside his children and grandchildren. Molly's hair turned silver, but her blue eyes remained bright and her spirit young. They celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary with a huge gathering that lasted 3 days. People came from all over the state to honor the couple who had become pillars of their community. There were speeches and toasts, and so much laughter that Molly's sides ached. During the celebration, Emma stood up to speak about her parents. Now a mature woman in her 30s with a family of her own, she spoke with emotion about the day her mother had been abandoned at the chapel. "I was too young to remember that day," she said, her voice thick with feeling. "But I have heard the story many times. My mother sat on those chapel steps with me in her arms, wondering how she would survive, how she would feed me, where we would go. And then a cowboy rode by, a man who could have kept riding, who had no obligation to help us. But he stopped. He looked at us, and he said words that changed all of our lives. 'You both have a home with me.'" Emma's voice broke, and she paused to compose herself. "That cowboy, my father Grant Hayes, did not just give us a home. He gave us safety and love and security. He raised me as his own daughter, never once treating me as anything less than his child. He taught me what a real father is, what a real man is, and he showed my mother what love should be." She raised her glass. "To my parents, who taught all of us what it means to be family. Who showed us that family is not always about blood, but about choosing to love and care for each other, day after day, year after year. Thank you for everything you have given us." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, and Molly saw tears streaming down Grant's face. He pulled both her and Emma into a tight embrace, and they stood together, a family forged not by blood but by choice and love. More years passed, bringing with them the inevitable changes of aging. Grant's joints grew stiff from decades of hard work, and he began to leave more of the ranch management to Samuel and the twins. Molly's eyesight dimmed, making it harder for her to do the fine sewing she loved, but she adapted, taking up knitting instead and creating warm blankets for each of her grandchildren. They spent more time together, just the two of them, enjoying the quiet moments that had once been so rare when the house was filled with young children. They would sit together in the parlor, Grant reading aloud while Molly knitted, or they would take slow walks around the property, pointing out changes and remembering how things used to be. On the morning of their 35th wedding anniversary, Molly woke to find Grant already awake, watching her with a soft smile. "Good morning, my love," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "Good morning," she replied, reaching out to touch his face. His hair was completely silver now, and his face was lined with age, but to her, he was as handsome as the day they met. 35 years, he mused. Where did the time go? Into building a life, Molly said. Into raising children and working the ranch and loving each other. It went exactly where it should have gone. They spent the day quietly, just the two of them. The children had offered to throw a big celebration, but Grant and Molly had declined, wanting instead to simply enjoy each other's company. They took a picnic lunch to the spot by the creek where Grant had proposed, and they talked about their memories, their blessings, and their love. "I need you to know something," Grant said as they sat on the blanket, the water burbling softly beside them. "If I had my life to live over again, I would not change a single thing. Every choice, every moment, every challenge, and every joy, they all led me here to this moment with you, and I am grateful for all of it." "So am I," Molly said, tears sliding down her wrinkled cheeks. "You were my salvation, Grant. You and this family, this life we built together, you saved me in every way a person can be saved." They kissed then, a gentle kiss filled with decades of love and devotion. And as they sat together by the creek, holding hands and watching the water flow past, Molly felt complete peace. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, just as they always had. The ranch continued to thrive under Samuel's management and the twins' hard work. Emma's children were now young adults, some starting families of their own. The cycle of life continued, each generation building on the foundation that Grant and Molly had laid. As Molly approached her 60th birthday, she began to think more about legacy and what she wanted to pass on to her children and grandchildren. She started writing down her memories, the story of how she had been abandoned at the chapel and how Grant had saved her. She wanted future generations to know where they came from, to understand the love and sacrifice that had built this family. Grant helped her with the writing, filling in his own memories and perspectives. Together, they created a family history that would be treasured for generations to come. One winter evening, as a fire crackled in the hearth and snow fell softly outside, their children and grandchildren gathered to hear Molly read from the family history. She told them about Thomas and the abandonment, about sitting on those chapel steps with baby Emma in her arms, feeling desperate and alone. "And then," she said, looking up from the pages to meet Grant's eyes across the room, "a cowboy rode by. He was dusty from the trail heading into town for supplies. He could have kept riding. He could have assumed someone else would help. But he did not. He stopped and he asked if we were all right. And when he learned what had happened, he offered us something precious, a home." The children and grandchildren listened with rapt attention as Molly continued the story, describing the early days at the ranch, the slow building of trust and friendship, the growing love that neither she nor Grant had expected, but that had become the foundation of their lives. "What your grandfather did was not just an act of kindness," Molly said, her voice strong despite her age. "It was an act of love. He loved us before he even knew us because he saw people in need and he responded with compassion and generosity. That is the legacy he leaves you. That is what I want you all to remember and to practice in your own lives." Grant cleared his throat, standing up slowly with the help of his cane. "Your grandmother is being too generous. I did not do anything special. I just did what anyone with a heart should do. But what I want you all to know is that taking in Molly and Emma was the best decision I ever made. They gave me more than I ever gave them. They gave me family and love and purpose. So if there is a lesson here, it is this: love is not something you find. It is something you build, day by day, choice by choice, and it is always worth the effort." The room was silent for a moment, and then the grandchildren rushed forward to hug their grandparents, telling them how much they loved them and how grateful they were for the family they had built. That night, as Molly and Grant lay in their beds surrounded by the memories of decades of love, Molly whispered, "We did it. We built something beautiful." "We did," Grant agreed, pulling her close, "and it will continue long after we are gone." The seasons turned, and eventually Grant's health began to fail. He had lived a hard life, working the ranch for more than 40 years, and his body was tired. But his spirit remained strong, and his love for Molly never wavered. On a beautiful spring morning, much like the morning when they had first met, Grant passed away peacefully in his sleep, Molly's hand in his. He was 68 years old, and he had lived a full, rich life. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, all of them touched in some way by Grant's kindness and generosity. Molly stood strong throughout the service, supported by her children and grandchildren, but inside her heart was breaking. Grant had been her partner, her love, her best friend for more than 3 decades. Life without him seemed impossible to imagine. But as the days turned to weeks and the weeks to months, Molly found that she could go on. She had to, for her children and grandchildren, for the legacy that she and Grant had built together. She remained on the ranch, living in the house they had expanded and improved over the years, surrounded by family and love. Emma moved back to the ranch to care for her mother, bringing her family with her. Samuel visited daily, and the twins made sure their mother never wanted for anything. The grandchildren came and went, filling the house with noise and life, just as Grant would have wanted. Molly lived for another 8 years, reaching the age of 73. In that time, she saw more great-grandchildren born, watched her family continue to grow and flourish, and spent countless hours sharing stories about Grant and their life together. On the anniversary of the day Grant had found her at the chapel, Molly took one last trip into Concord. Emma drove her in the wagon, and they stopped at the small chapel that still stood in the center of town. Molly walked slowly up to the entrance and sat down on the steps, just as she had done more than 40 years earlier. "This is where it all began," she said to Emma. "This is where I sat with you in my arms, terrified and alone, not knowing what would happen next. And this is where your father found us." Emma sat down beside her mother, tears streaming down her face. "Tell me again, Mama, tell me what he said." Molly smiled, her eyes distant with memory. "He looked at us and his face was so kind, and he said, 'You both have a home with me,' just like that. So simple, so certain. He gave us everything with those words." "He loved you so much," Emma said. "And I loved him," Molly replied. "Every day of our life together I loved him, and I will love him until I take my last breath." A few months later, on a warm summer evening surrounded by all of her children and grandchildren, Molly passed away in her sleep. Her last words were Grant's name, spoken with a smile on her lips. They buried her next to Grant on a hillside overlooking the ranch, under a big oak tree that they had planted together in the early years of their marriage. The headstone read, "Molly Crawford Hayes, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She was never alone again." The ranch remained in the family, passed down through the generations. Samuel's son took over the management, and the twins' children continued the horse breeding program. Emma's grandchildren built houses on the property, creating a compound where the extended family could gather and celebrate their shared history. The story of Grant and Molly became family legend, told and retold at gatherings and passed down to each new generation. The account that Molly had written became a treasured family heirloom, read at weddings and celebrations. And through it all, the values that Grant and Molly had lived by, kindness, compassion, hard work, and above all love, continued to guide their descendants. They had started with nothing but hope and determination, and they had built an empire of love that would endure for generations. The small chapel in Concord still stood, a quiet monument to beginnings and second chances. Sometimes, members of the Hayes family would visit it, standing on the steps where their story began, and remembering the lonely cowboy and the abandoned woman who had found each other at exactly the right moment. Because that was the true miracle of Grant and Molly's story. Not just that they had survived hardship and built a good life, but that they had found each other when both of them needed saving. That they had chosen love when it would have been easier to give up. that they had built a family based not on blood alone, but on devotion and commitment and the daily choice to be there for each other. Their love story became a beacon for all who came after them, a reminder that it is never too late for a new beginning, that kindness matters, and that true love is not about grand gestures but about showing up day after day and choosing to love even when it is hard. Grant and Molly Hayes had started their journey on the steps of a chapel in Concord, New Hampshire, in the spring of 1876. He had been a lonely cowboy with a dream. She had been an abandoned woman with a baby and nowhere to turn. But together, they had built something extraordinary. A family, a legacy, and a love story that would be remembered and celebrated for generations to come. And in the end, that was the greatest gift they gave to their children and grandchildren. The knowledge that love conquers all, that family is everything, and that home is not a place, but the people you choose to share your life with. The ranch still stands today, now run by the fifth generation of the Hayes family. The cabin has been expanded many times, but the original structure remains, carefully preserved as a reminder of where it all began. Visitors to the property often ask about the portraits that hang in the parlor, two weathered faces looking out with eyes full of wisdom and love. And when asked about the story behind those portraits, the current Hayes family members smile and begin the tale that they know by heart. She was abandoned at the chapel with a baby, and a lonely cowboy said, "You both have a home with me." And from those simple words, a legacy was born.